Hi, I'm Darren. I'm the brewer and co-owner of Good Neighbor Brews in Wiley, Texas, and this is Homebrew Homeschool. And we're here today to brew a very light Christmas ale, perfect for the holidays and Thanksgiving. That'll be a crowd pleaser, and it's very easy to brew. And we're going to get back to the basics with the techniques of brewing, and this is going to be an all-grain brew. Starting off, it's going to be in the style of a blonde ale. And at the end, we're going to add rosemary to it to add some holiday flavor to it. And this is a beer we serve in our tap room during the holidays. All right, basic safety tips. This can be done in your garage. I choose to do it in the backyard because it's a lot easier. I certainly wouldn't put a propane burner in your house. You can do this on your stove if your stove can put out enough heat. Most cannot to boil 5 gallons of water without taking hours to do it. Some safety items, I always have a hose handy. When you're dealing with fire, you never know what's going to happen. It's always good to have a hose handy to put out anything that might catch on fire accidentally. So here's a boil kettle. It's a 15-gallon kettle, but we're making a 5-gallon batch today, so it's not completely full. Right now it's got about 5 gallons of water in it, which we're going to bring up to about 165 degrees to start our mash. A mash is where we put the grain in the water and let it sit for an hour to convert the starches into sugars that we need for fermentation. So right now I'm going to light the boiler so we can get it up to 165 degrees, and once it's there we'll be adding the grain to it. So this is just a standard propane burner bought at a sporting goods store for camping. Does plenty good on just a regular barbecue tank for heating up the water. And it'll take us about 20 minutes to get this water to 165 degrees. And that's where we're gonna start. So this is the mash tun that we'll be using. We'll be putting the hot water in here along with the grain and let it sit for an hour while the mash happens. While the mash is happening, the starches in the grain will be converting into sugars that we need for fermentation. At the end of that hour, we're gonna drain off the liquid, leaving the grains behind. And the way this is accomplished is I have a braided hose, same thing you could buy at Lowe's, where I got the cooler, and what it does, and I pull out the rubber insert inside the hose, so what's left is just the mesh braid. That mesh braid is a filter that will leave the grain behind. Now brewing, since it's such an organic process, it has to be very clean, it has to be very sanitary in order to make a good beer. If you have dirty cookware and dirty utensils, you're gonna get a dirty beer that's gonna have some off flavors. So it's very important to keep things sanitized. I have a bucket of water that I'm going to use, and I put all my utensils and everything that's going to touch the beer in that bucket of water, and I add some sanitizer. This sanitizer is iodophor. It's an iodine-based sanitizer. It's very inexpensive and very little is needed. It takes about 1 teaspoon for every couple gallons in order to keep everything sanitized. So I just dumped about 2 teaspoons of iodophor into the water, which will keep everything that touches it sanitized. The iodophor that I use, as well as many other types of sanitizers, are easily available at any homebrew store. Some people may tell you bleach is a good sanitizer, and it is. The problem with bleach is that it will affect the taste of your beer. It'll give it a cardboard, papery taste, which is a very common off flavor. You want to keep all forms of bleach and chlorine out of your beer, which brings us to the next point. In addition to keeping chlorine out of your cleaning water and out of your sanitizing water, it's also important to keep chlorine out of your brewing water. Most municipal water supplies sanitize their water with chlorine or chloramines, and this needs to be removed. If you have an at-home on-the-sink water filter that takes chlorine out, that'll work. If you don't, an easy way to do it is to get what's called Camden tablets. They're typically used in camping. They're for sanitizing water, for making it drinkable. It also removes all the chlorine. So the Camden tablets are also called potassium metabisulfate. That's what they might also be referred to as, and they're also available in homebrew stores. So the way Camden tablets are used to dechlorinate the water is for a 5-gallon batch. Each tablet can handle up to 20 gallons. For good measure, I use a half a tablet, and I go over to the water and just sprinkle it in. Just crush it up with my fingers, it turns into powder, and let it be in there. That'll take all the chlorine out during the boil, and you'll have a much cleaner tasting beer. Okay, the next step is to pour the grain, which has already been milled, into the strike water. The strike water is the name for the initial water that we use to mash the grains. So once it's poured in there, we stir it around to make sure it's all wet and there's no dough balls that formed. And then at that point, we'll put the lid on it and let it sit for an hour and let the mash conversion take place. So once our mash is complete and the hour is complete, we're gonna rinse those grains, called sparging, and we're gonna need more hot water to do that. So what I'm gonna do is fill up my kettle again and put the extra hot water in my other cooler, which will keep it hot for when that hour is up and we can use it for sparging. So now while our grains are mashing, we're heating up some of the sparge water. It's always a good idea to stay close, not get too far. It might be a great time to grab a beer and come back, but leaving a boiling pot unattended could never be a good idea. So while our mash is continuing, I heated up some extra water for our sparge water. So this is water, it's about 180 degrees now. I'm going to put it in my other cooler and keep it on hand. So when we rinse the grains, called sparging, we'll have that hot water to do that. So I should share with you the recipe for this beer. It's 11 pounds of 2-row malt as a base malt. And I added 1 pound of Crystal 60, which is a more roasted malt. It's a little darker and it adds sweetness to the brew. And so I added 1 pound of that to add some sweetness to the beer. And in addition to the grain, we're using Cascade hops as our hop for both the boil hops and the Whirlpool hops. I use 1/2 ounce of Cascade in the boil, which will add very little bitterness to it because we want the rosemary flavor to come out. And we also use 1/2 ounce of Cascade hops in the Whirlpool just to add some aroma, some more character to the beer, neither of which will be overpowering. And so it'll allow the rosemary to really be the prominent flavor. I mentioned this was going to be a rosemary beer, and rosemary grows very well in Texas. I use the rosemary that's in my front yard to flavor the beer, and you only need a small amount. About this much rosemary will flavor the entire 5-gallon batch. We're going to put this in after fermentation's done and let it sit in there for about a week. Once that's done, the beer will be very rosemary flavored. We'll of course need to sterilize this because there's a lot of wild yeast in it and things we don't want in our beer. And the way we do that is we can spray sanitizer on it. It's food grade sanitizer, so you can just rinse it off. Or you can put it in a plastic bag and boil that bag just to get it up to temperature. You don't want to boil the rosemary itself because you'll remove all the flavor from it. So while we're waiting for the mash to be done, we can prepare our fermenter. It needs to be sanitized, as we mentioned before. Everything needs to be sanitary. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this auto siphon to pump some sanitizer into the fermenter, which is just a 6-gallon glass jug. So we just want to keep that clean. I put it on a towel just because if it's on concrete, I wouldn't want to, a stone or something to shatter the glass. So once the fermenter has some sanitizer in it, it's good to splash it around inside and sanitize the inside of the fermenter. I leave it in there until we need it, and I'll splash it around again just before we add the cooled beer to it. The next step, now that mashing is done, is to drain the liquid from the mash tun into the boil kettle. I'll turn on this valve and we'll drain it really slowly. It should take about 45 minutes to drain the entire 5 gallons into the boil kettle. We want it to go slow because we're basically rinsing the sugars out of the grain. If you do it too fast, you'll miss a lot of sugar. And so I'll open the valve and we can start. As we drain the beer out of the mash tun, we'll need to add more water to complete our 5 gallons since the grain in there will absorb a lot of it. I prepared another cooler full of 5 gallons of hot water that I'm going to slowly add to this. There's a lot of tools and pumps and complicated ways to do this. I have found it easy to just get a ladle, scoop the water, and just rinse it on top. Being real careful not to drill a hole down in the grain. The grain bed is floating and it acts like a filter. So what you want to do is very gently, without disturbing the grain, add the hot water to it. Let it flow into the boil kettle until you get your desired amount, which in this case is our 5 gallons. All right, now that we've drained all the beer out of the mash tun, we have it in the boil kettle. We're going to bring it to a boil, add hops, and let it boil for an hour. Adding the hops will add bitterness to the brew. We're going to add 1/2 ounce of Cascade hops, so they have a very mild bitterness, and it's going to take that hour of boil to get all the bitterness out of the hops. So now that our beer has come to a boil, we're going to add the 1/2 ounce of Cascade bittering hops. You can just pour it right into the beer. And you want to mix it around a little bit. People will tell you to cover the boil to make it boil more efficiently. With beer, this is not the case. You want it to boil very, very rapidly because it's boiling off a lot of things that you don't want in your finished beer. So the harder the boil, the better. The only problem with the harder the boil is that you're boiling off a lot of water. So when the beer is boiling, you want it to boil as rapidly as you can without boiling off too much water. The Whirlpool hops are added at the end of the beer because there's a lot of suspended proteins in the beer that you want to not get in the fermenter. So by whirlpooling, they make a cone in the middle, similar if you're stirring sugar in your iced tea, it all goes to the center. So now we're finished with our boil, and the next step is to drain the beer from the boil kettle into our fermenter. And it's important to cool the beer as quickly as possible. I'm using a plate chiller for that. This plate chiller has hose water running through it one way and beer running through it another way, which will bring the beer from a boiling temperature down to about 60 degrees, 60, 70 degrees, or the temperature of the groundwater very quickly. And that's important for a clear beer. The plate chiller is available online. They're about $60, $70, and they're a very efficient way to cool the beer down quickly. There's other ways to do it, but this is probably the simplest. The yeast we're using in this recipe is Safe Ale US-05. It's a very general purpose yeast and works well and makes for very clean beer. In the past, people always thought liquid yeast was the best, and in recent years, dry yeast has really improved and become a very good yeast. So we use this, but the benefit of using dry yeast is that liquid yeast needs a starter. You have to plan a couple days in advance, make a starter, and really bloom the yeast. With dry yeast, we can add it to water, and in about 20 minutes, it's ready to pitch into the beer. I'm gonna add this yeast to water that's about 105 degrees and let it sit for about 20 minutes. Once that's done, it'll be a frothy yeast. We can add it right to the beer, and fermentation should begin immediately. All right, now that our beer is in the fermenter and our yeast has bloomed for about 20 minutes, we're ready to pitch it in the beer. And it's very important to reoxygenate the beer once you pitch the yeast. All the oxygen has boiled out, and the yeast needs the oxygen to start fermentation. So we can do that just by shaking it up. We can shake it like this for about 10 minutes, and it'll add all the oxygen we need to the beer to begin fermentation. Now that we're done, we need to put the beer in a safe place to ferment. If you have a spare refrigerator available, you can get a temperature controller and allow the fridge to stay at about 65 degrees, and that would make for a perfect fermentation. Temperature control is very important. If you don't have this available to you, a dark closet will work well too. Just make sure you keep a towel over the beer because light will affect the hops in the beer. And in about a week and a half, your beer should be fully fermented and ready to keg or bottle as you wish. So once the beer's done fermenting, in about a week and a half, you can add the rosemary that we spoke of earlier to add the great holiday flavor. Thanks for tuning in. I enjoyed brewing beer with you.